The case of Lieutenant Elias Thorne began with a kind of finality that military bureaucracy excels at. It was November 1952, over the jagged, frozen ridgelines of the Korean peninsula. Thorne, a seasoned pilot with the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, was leading a flight of F-86 Sabres on a combat air patrol near the Yalu River, a region pilots called MiG Alley. At 14:15 hours, his wingman, Lieutenant Miller, witnessed a catastrophic engine failure in Thorne's aircraft, followed by a violent pitchdown. There was no parachute. The silver jet impacted the side of a granite peak in a bloom of orange fire that stood out sharply against the winter snow. For 3 days, the crash site was inaccessible due to heavy anti-aircraft fire and a relentless blizzard. When the recovery team finally reached the smoldering scar on the mountain, the scene was a textbook definition of unsurvivable. The fuselage of the Sabre had disintegrated upon impact. Amidst the twisted blackened ribs of the cockpit, the team recovered a pair of heat-warped dog tags and a scorched flight helmet bearing the hand-painted name, Thorne. The recovery report was clinical. It noted that while the remains were fragmentary due to the high-speed impact and subsequent fuel fire, the presence of the pilot's personal effects and the lack of an ejection seat deployment confirmed the fatality. Elias Thorne was officially declared killed in action. Back at Kimpo Air Base, his locker was cleared, his letters were bundled to be sent home to Ohio, and a memorial service was held in the drafty base chapel. The burial took place 2 weeks later at Arlington National Cemetery. It was a cold, gray afternoon with a biting wind that snapped the American flag held over the casket. Thorne's widow, Clara, received the folded triangle of wool, her face a mask of pale grief. The bugler played taps, the notes hanging thin and lonely in the freezing air. The earth was shoveled over the steel vault, and a white marble headstone was commissioned, etched with his name, his rank, and the date of his final flight, November 14, 1952. To the United States Air Force, Elias Thorne was a closed file, a statistic of the Cold War. His name was moved to the rolls of the honored dead, and his squadron mates began the painful process of forgetting. In the high-stress environment of jet combat, grief is a luxury. The living had to focus on the next mission. No one expected to see the tail number of Thorne's lost Sabre ever again, let alone hear his voice crackling through the dark over the Sea of Japan. But exactly 31 days after the dirt hit his casket, the closed file of Elias Thorne blew wide open in the most terrifying way possible. The night of December 15, 1952, was an inkpot night. The kind of moonless, oppressive dark that makes a pilot feel like they are flying inside a bucket of coal. A 3-ship formation of F-86 Sabres from the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing was returning from an escort mission near the Swaho Dam. They were low on fuel, their eyes strained from staring at the dim red glow of their instrument panels, when a 4th aircraft silently slipped into their formation. Lieutenant Miller, who had seen Thorne's jet disintegrate on that granite peak a month prior, was flying the trailing position. He glanced to his left and his heart nearly stopped. Floating less than 50 feet from his wingtip was an F-86 with a distinct hand-painted yellow E on the tail, the personal marking of Elias Thorne. "Lead, this is Miller." His voice was a strangled whisper over the radio. "We've got a joiner on my port side. He's flying Thorne's tail number 397. The formation lead, Captain Harrison, banked his jet to look back. The landing lights of the formation caught the silver skin of the intruder. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't just the plane. The pilot was sitting upright, his head turned toward them. Through the cockpit plexiglass, illuminated by the ghostly green backlighting of the intruder's own instrument panel, was the unmistakable profile of Elias Thorne. He wasn't wearing an oxygen mask. He was looking directly at Miller, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes reflecting the stars like 2 pieces of glass. "Elias." Harrison's voice cracked over the tactical frequency. "Thorne, is that you? Come in, 397. The intruder didn't respond with words. Instead, the pilot raised a gloved hand in a slow, mechanical salute, the exact, idiosyncratic way Thorne used to signal his wingman before breaking formation. For 5 agonizing minutes, the ghost ship flew with them. The 3 pilots watched in stunned silence, their breath hitching in their masks. They could see the individual rivets on the wing, the soot from the gun ports, and the weathered Michigan Belle nose art that Thorne had commissioned just weeks before his death. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was a physical, three-dimensional object displacing the air around them. The roar of its engine was audible over their own, a low, rhythmic thrumming that felt out of sync with the standard J-47 turbines. As they approached the coast, the intruder pulled into a gentle, climbing turn to the north. Miller tried to follow, but his fuel warning light flickered red. He watched as the silver Sabre vanished into a bank of clouds, leaving 3 veteran combat pilots shivering in their cockpits. When they landed at Kimpo, they didn't go to the mess hall. They went straight to the colonel's office. They didn't have a story, they had a shared, unanimous, and terrifying certainty. Elias Thorne was back in the air. The unanimous testimony of 3 decorated combat pilots was enough to send the base into a state of hushed, paranoid energy, but the military thrives on data, not ghost stories. While Miller and Harrison were being interrogated in separate windowless rooms, the ground-controlled interception, GCI, officers at Kimpo were frantically rewinding the magnetic tape of the night's radar sweeps. If what the pilots saw was a hallucination, the radar should have shown 3 blips. Instead, the glowing green cathode ray tube revealed a haunting, undeniable 4th. Track 4 Alpha, the lead radar controller whispered, his finger tracing a steady, pulsing on the screen. He joined the formation at 22:15 over the Han River. He wasn't there one sweep, and then he was, just like a door opening in the sky. What turned the incident from a UFO sighting into a full-blown intelligence crisis was the transponder signal. Every F-86 Sabre was equipped with an IFF, Identification Friend or Foe system, a primitive but effective electronic handshake that beamed a specific 4-digit code back to the radar stations. As the technicians zoomed in on Track 4 Alpha, the digital readout flickered and stabilized. It wasn't a generic code. It was the unique, encrypted signature assigned specifically to Lieutenant Elias Thorne's lost aircraft, tail number 397. "That's impossible," the wing commander growled, leaning over the controller's shoulder. "That transponder was crushed into 1,000 pieces on a mountainside in North Korea. We recovered the wreckage. We saw the fire. Yet, there it was. The blip didn't behave like a phantom or a glitch. It held a perfect formation position, maintaining exactly 420 knots with the physical displacement of a 15-ton aircraft. It wasn't a ghost in the electronic sense, it was a solid return, bouncing radio waves back with the signature of high-grade aeronautical aluminum. Even more chilling was the altitude. The radar showed the 4th plane maintaining a constant height of 30,000 feet, but as it broke away from the formation, the blip didn't descend or climb. It began to strobe, the radar term for a signal that is rapidly losing and regaining its lock. For 12 minutes, the Kimpo radar operators tracked Thorne's ghost. They watched it head north, back toward the very ridgeline where he had perished. Every time the radar swept past the coordinates, the IFF would blink. Thorne/397/active. It was a digital heartbeat from a dead man. When the blip finally reached the crash site coordinates, it didn't fade away. It simply stopped. The radar swept the area again and again, but the screen was empty. There was no debris cloud, no splash on the screen to indicate a crash. The signal had simply ceased to exist, leaving the controllers staring at a blank patch of green phosphorus and a recording that defied every law of physics and military intelligence. The morning of December 16, 1952, brought no relief to Kimpo Air Base. Instead, it brought a team of high-ranking investigators from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, OSI. The ghost flight of Elias Thorne was no longer a campfire story for pilots. It was treated as a potential breach of national security. The military's first instinct was not to look at the supernatural, but to look for a conspiracy. The primary theory was chilling. Had the Soviets or the North Koreans captured Thorne, salvaged his radio equipment, and staged a psychological warfare operation? The investigation began at the crash site. A second recovery team was dispatched via helicopter, braving sniper fire to return to the granite peak. They were ordered to re-verify every scrap of metal. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, they sifted through the blackened snow. The results were devastating to the fraud theory. The engine block of Thorne's original F-86 was still fused to the rock, its serial numbers matching perfectly. The cockpit area was a void of melted glass and scorched wiring. Most importantly, the transponder unit, the very heart of the IFF signal, was found. It was a crushed, charred lump of vacuum tubes and silver solder, physically incapable of emitting even a spark, let alone a sophisticated encrypted handshake. If the real transponder is here, sitting in the mud, the lead investigator noted in his log, then what was screaming Thorne at the radar towers last night? The investigators then turned to the pilots. Miller, Harrison, and the third wingman were subjected to grueling, 12-hour interrogations. They were tested for hypoxia, carbon monoxide poisoning, and combat fatigue hallucinations. Their flight logs were scrutinized for discrepancies. But the men held firm. Their descriptions of the Michigan Belle nose art and the specific mechanical salute were too consistent to be a mass delusion. Furthermore, the radar tapes from the GCI station were sent to Tokyo for forensic analysis. The experts there confirmed the tapes had not been tampered with. The fourth blip was a solid, physical return. The investigation hit a brick wall when they looked into the possibility of a decoy aircraft. To mimic a Sabre's radar signature and transponder code, the enemy would have needed a captured F-86 in perfect flying condition, along with the highly classified encryption keys that were changed weekly. Even then, no pilot, Soviet or otherwise, could have perfectly mimicked Thorne's idiosyncratic flying style, which Harrison described as leading with a heavy left wing, a trait the ghost ship had displayed during the 5-minute formation flight. By the end of the week, the OSI file was thick with technical data but void of answers. They couldn't prove it was a ghost, but they had definitively proven it wasn't a man, a machine, or a lie. The pilot who appeared twice was becoming a haunting anomaly that threatened to undermine the rational foundation of the entire Air Force Command. The climax of the Thorne anomaly occurred on the night of December 21, 1952, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. This time, the Air Force was ready. Following the initial sighting, the wing commander had authorized Combat Air Patrol Ghost, a pair of Sabres kept on 5-minute alert with orders to intercept any unidentified return matching the 397 transponder code. At 23:10 hours, the radar at Kimpo bloomed. Track 4 Alpha was back, appearing mid-air at 35,000 feet over the Sea of Japan, tracking a direct course toward the airbase. Captain Hap Holloway and his wingmen scrambled, their turbines screaming as they punched through the low-hanging cloud deck. Guided by the frantic vectors of the GCI controllers, they intercepted the target 10 miles out from the coast. "Kimpo, we have visual," Holloway's voice crackled, tight with adrenaline. "It's a Sabre. Silver finish. Navigation lights are off, but the cockpit is lit. It's him. It's 397. Holloway pulled alongside, his wingtip barely 10 feet from the Phantom jet. He turned on his powerful landing light, bathing the intruder in a harsh, artificial glare. The Michigan Belle nose art was vivid, the paint looking fresh as the day it was applied. Inside the cockpit, the figure of Elias Thorne sat motionless, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He looked weathered, his flight suit grayed with what looked like frost or ash, but his eyes were wide and fixed forward. "Thorne, this is Holloway. You are entering restricted airspace. Acknowledge or we will be forced to engage." There was no radio reply, but the ghost ship began to perform a maneuver that defied the structural limits of the F-86. It didn't bank, it pivoted on its axis, a flat rotation that would have ripped the wings off any physical aircraft. The intruder surged forward with an acceleration that left the two interceptors standing still. Holloway pushed his throttle into the detent, his engine roaring in pursuit, but the Silver Sabre stayed exactly 300 yards ahead, mockingly out of reach. Then, as they crossed the shoreline of the peninsula, the ghost ship began to glow. It wasn't a fire, it was a soft, pulsating luminescence emanating from the rivets of the fuselage. The radar controllers at Kimpo watched in awe as the blip on their screens grew in intensity, becoming a bloom that obscured the signals of the pursuing jets. "He's punching out," Holloway yelled, but there was no ejection seat, no canopy jettison. Instead, the silver jet simply began to translucent. Holloway could see the stars through the wings of the Sabre. In a final silent burst of white light that momentarily blinded the intercepting pilots, the aircraft vanished. There was no explosion, no splash, and no debris. The radar screens went flat. The IFF signal, which had been screaming its encrypted code for 20 minutes, fell silent. Elias Thorne had appeared twice, and now he had vanished twice, this time taking the very laws of reality with him. Holloway circled the empty patch of sky for an hour, but all he found was the cold, indifferent moonlight reflecting off the waves below. In the aftermath of the December 21st disappearance, the Air Force faced a crisis of narrative. The official Thorne incident file was eventually classified under a top-secret designation, but the internal debate raged between the cold logic of the flight surgeons and the raw testimony of the pilots. The prevailing, scientific theory put forward by the Air Force Medical Corps was that of mass grief hallucination, a rare but documented psychological phenomenon where a high-stress group, bound by shared trauma and exhaustion, begins to project a collective wish fulfillment onto their environment. The flight surgeons argued that the pilots of the Fourth Wing were suffering from a localized outbreak of combat hysteria. They suggested that Miller, having witnessed the initial crash, had subconsciously seeded the idea of Thorne's return into the minds of his squad mates. In the sensory deprivation of a night flight, where the horizon disappears and the brain struggles to interpret dim lights, the surgeons claimed the pilots had collectively hallucinated the Silver Sabre and the Michigan Belle nose art. They pointed to the uncanny nature of the sighting, the lack of an oxygen mask, the frozen expression, as proof that the pilots were seeing a mental construct rather than a physical man. Grief is a powerful lens, one psychiatric report noted. To these men, Elias Thorne wasn't just a pilot, he was the soul of the squadron. Their brains simply refused to accept the finality of the granite peak. They didn't see a ghost, they saw a memory. However, this explanation crumbled when faced with the radar data. A collective hallucination can trick the human eye and the human heart, but it cannot trick a vacuum tube transponder or a ground-controlled interception dish. The fourth blip was a documented, electronic fact. To dismiss it, the investigators had to suggest a secondary, simultaneous phenomenon, atmospheric ducting or radar angels. They hypothesized that a unique temperature inversion over the Sea of Japan had reflected the signals of the other three jets, creating a ghost return that just happened to mimic Thorne's specific IFF code, a statistical impossibility that the military preferred over the alternative. The pilots, for their part, never bought the hallucination theory. Hap Holloway, who had seen the stars through the wings of the ghost ship, spent the rest of his career refusing to discuss the night in detail. To the men in the cockpits, the explanation was simpler, if more terrifying. They believed that Thorne, or some remnant of his will, had remained in the cockpit to finish a mission that death had interrupted. By 1953, the sightings stopped. The pilot who appeared twice became a ghost story whispered in the officers' club, a warning about the thin veil between the world of the living and the great hangar in the sky. Whether it was a glitch in the radar of the mind or a glitch in the fabric of time, Elias Thorne remains one of aviation's most haunting anomalies. A man who died once, flew twice, and vanished forever into the digital and spiritual ether.